Greetings and welcome to this edition of
Positronic.
I'm Barry P. Cook. I'm here to talk about Season 1, Episode 5 of Star Trek Strange New Worlds. It was called Spock Amok, which of course is a reference to Amok Time. It is referential of, I should say, the original series episode Amok Time, which of course involves Spock and T'Pring, and they did a good job with the trappings of that episode being present in this one, the gong that's used and the tambourine type thing. And, you know, they talk about Kali Faye, and they even used the original music. You know what I'm talking about. And in this scene, we see that Spock has to fight himself. And by that I mean his human half, which has human ears and human eyebrows and all that, has to fight his Vulcan half for T'Pring's favor, I guess. So clearly it's some kind of dream. Anyway, Spock wakes from what was obviously a sort of dream or nightmare and begins a science officer's log in which he explains that the crew is getting some rest at Starbase 1, where he is being visited by T'Pring. And she and he recite the greeting dialogue from Amok Time, which they spoke to each other when they first see each other in that episode. Right before, in this one.
What?
No, it's kissing. You don't want to hear that.
I don't mind so much.
Okay.
They have a little smooch. They have a little snog. Apparently, she is traveling with an assistant named Cattell, I think that's the name, who could be either a guy or a gal. We don't know at this point because their name, doesn't follow the normal Vulcan name pattern. She and Spock arrange to meet each other for dinner later after their various duties are tended to. She's there with her assistant to see to the sort of capture or bringing in of a Vulcan dissident. Admiral April shows up to explain that Pike, who is wearing the alternate captain's tunic, the green one, or the Strange New Worlds version of it, I should say, needs to negotiate a treaty or at least some sort of passage agreement deal with the Rongovians, who could at any moment decide to ally with the Klingons or the Romulans. They bring up the Klingons, which is interesting. We haven't heard anything about them since they disappeared in season 2 of Discovery, thankfully. And these Rongovians have traveled to the space station for this meeting by means of a solar sail ship, which delights Uhura. She sees it and she just loves it. And it is pretty gorgeous, actually, once you get to see it. Anyway, this delegation arrives early, and they insist that the negotiations begin presently, so everybody has to sort of improvise. Nurse Chapel and Ortegas and the doctor appear to be taking some shore leave together, and there were some funny moments surrounding their departure from the ship, which included an apparent disclosure that Nurse Chapel is bisexual. And I want to repeat what I've said before about this character, which is that I enjoy this version of the character, but I don't know why they just didn't call her something else, because it's not Nurse Chapel. And, I'm not any kind of a Nurse Chapel stan where I feel like they're disrespecting the character or it's not Chapel. Why did they just give her another name? I'm not saying it from that point of view. I'm saying it, because so it's not a dig. I'm saying that the character, this version of Chapel stands on its own as a really good character, I think. And I think it deserved its own name. I don't think they had to give it a legacy name. Certainly there was no particular reason to do that. So in a way, it kind of robs this totally unique, very cool character of its own identity, not allowing it to stand on its own with its own name. But I don't know, the actress is thrilled to be playing a legacy character and to be innovating with it. So I wouldn't want to take that away from her, but I don't know. I kind of feel bad for the character, which of course isn't real, but I don't know. I don't know. I think it was an unfortunate choice to give her that name. But anyway, T'Pring is quite annoyed, even though Vulcans don't get annoyed. So they say, though clearly they do, that he was late for their dinner. And she gives him the cold shoulder and kind of leaves after saying that she thinks his apparent tendency to behave in a humanish way might make them incompatible, which I didn't understand because, all he did was do his duty. And I don't see how another Vulcan would see that as anything but logical. Like, maybe you're not compatible, but it's not a fault of his. It's just that you aren't compatible with someone who has a duty to Starfleet. So I don't know why she was giving him flack. I don't know. I mean, women, right? I'm kidding. Anyway, Chapel, looking super hot, is on a date on her shore leave, and she seems to want to skip dinner and go right to dessert, as it were. But the guy that she's with seems to want to talk about deepening their relationship, which puts her off, at which point she seems to notice Spock having a hard time and goes to sit with him. And I couldn't swear to it, but it seemed like when she saw Spock sitting by himself, she kind of got like a vibe, almost like a disturbance in the force, which of course doesn't apply. I don't know if I really saw that. It felt like it did. Anyway, she goes to sit with him. Number one and La'an have a conversation about how the crew seems to see number one as where fun goes to die. That's what they refer to her as. And they were having this conversation while walking around the ship, and they seem to come across a security breach, and they run off to deal with that. We cut back to Chapel, who tries to help Spock understand that he needs to find better balance between his work and his personal life if he wants his relationship to work out, which is why she doesn't bother with relationships, because she doesn't want to be bothered to have to do that herself. And he thanks her for her advice, saying that he would gladly return the favor. And she says, what are friends for? But he pretends not to realize that it was a rhetorical question. And then he says that he's teasing her, which I don't find to be very Spock. But again, this is a younger Spock, and we know he's not Spock yet. So I'm going to let it go. That's all there is I can say about that. So Spock and T'Pring now sit down to engage in a Vulcan soul-sharing ritual, which involves sitting facing each other and touching hands in a manner similar to the hand contact made by Spock and Saavik in Star Trek 3, as well as, if I'm not mistaken, Sarek and Amanda in Journey to Babel, and doing a little chant. And the ritual apparently is designed to allow them to mingle their consciousnesses so that they can better know each other. But what ends up happening is their consciousnesses switch bodies. So, yeah, Star Trek just pulled a Freaky Friday on a Thursday. And I want to say about this, before I go any further, that, it would be very easy to say, what the frack was that? What are they doing? Why in the world would they pull a body swap thing in a way that isn't heavily dramatic? I mean, it creates drama, but it's played more for fun and more for like light character development than like a heavy plot, where normally that's what you would use that trope for, a la The Intruder Within. And especially with Vulcans, like, because it's, there are comedy moments, and Vulcans are not usually comedy fodder, but they can be in a way that works. We've seen it before, and I think it worked in this episode, and I'll explain why as we go along. So part of me was going, really? They really with Spock do a body swap thing? Really? But they play it matter of fact. They play it seriously. It doesn't venture into screwball territory. So, I rolled with it, and I'm glad I did, but I'll explain as we go on. After we find that they've switched, we find that it turns out that the delegation doesn't want to continue negotiating after the first meeting unless they can deal only with Spock, who they took a shine to in the first meeting, but of course, he's now T'Pring. And when Pike shows up to tell Spock this, he and T'Pring have to tell him what's happened after trying not to tell him for a minute and trying to behave like each other so that he wouldn't notice, which they both, as characters and actors, successfully do, actually. So they have to get great credit for that. Spock totally comes off like a Vulcan woman, which you wouldn't, if someone said, behave like a Vulcan woman and you tried to do it, you'd behave like Spock, or you'd behave like Tuvok, or you'd behave like Saavik, which there's not a whole lot of difference between how those characters behave, and there isn't a lot of difference with T'Pring that you notice. But when Spock is being T'Pring and T'Pring is being Spock, there is a difference between them, and it's palpable, and it was just so cool to see these actors pull it off. It was really, really good, and really, it was akin to the work that Shatner did in Intruder Within, where he's playing a woman in his own body, and he takes a different approach to the physicality and the line delivery than he normally did as Kirk, and it worked. So it works here, and it was very cool and funny, which again, you don't think Vulcan funny, but it totally works, and I thought it was great. But it's funny because the captain didn't seem to notice, and they make a joke of it. It's like, you can obviously tell that, we're each other because we're behaving differently. And he's like, oh yeah, I could tell right off the bat. He's playing it like he can't, the joke being, that he can't tell, the joke being that Vulcans are all the same, that they're all stoic, they all do the logic thing, and there's not a lot of variation, but there in fact is, and you can see it, and it's funny that he can't. But I just thought the whole scene was really well done. But I do want to backtrack a little bit and say that I did find it a little hard to believe that swapping Khatras was that easy, given the difficulty that Talar says, one would have moving Khatras from one mind to another, but she was having to do it between an empty mind and a human, an empty-minded Vulcan and a human. So, maybe that's what made it more difficult, and why she says it's something that's only happened in legend. She wasn't necessarily referring to a swapping between two conscious beings, one of which is full Vulcan and the other being half. So I don't know, again, there's kind of wiggle room there, but I did for a second go, wait a minute, would it really be that easy? Anyway, the thing is, they're having trouble switching back. That's why Spock is stuck in T'Pring, and T'Pring is stuck trying to behave like Spock on an actual mission but an actual task as Spock, because they can't seem to undo it. So that's part of the joke as well. But anyway, which, is Freaky Friday, but it's okay. So moving on. Number 1 and La'an play good cop, bad cop with the two ensigns that they caught trying to go out an airlock, which they were doing to try to complete Enterprise Bingo, which we heard about before, but which number 1 and the security chief have never heard of. Meanwhile, T'Pring's assistant calls her to let her know that they need her to step in personally in order to convince this Vulcan dissident back to the path of logic, which of course Spock hesitates to do in her place, but there you go. We go back to number 1 and La'an, and they look up what Enterprise Bingo is, and they decide to play it themselves, which included completing tasks like firing phasers at each other on very, very, very low stun, testing their ability to beat the other person to directing the turbo lift by shouting a destination and before the other one, and determining whether or not gum regains its flavor if you chew it until the flavor is gone, and then beam the person chewing it away and then beam them back. And it does, which is very cool. But I'm sure it opens up a myriad of questions if we were to think about it, which I'll probably end up doing. Anyway, I thought that was cool. Spock goes to Chapel to try to find a medical solution, as to Pring, to try to find a medical solution to the problem of not being able to swap back. But she urges him to just try to actually do T'Pring's job because it would help him understand T'Pring on a deeper level, which is the whole point of why they did this Katra sharing thing to begin with. Back at the negotiations with the aliens, T'Pring as Spock kind of drops the ball, but Pike manages to pick it up by offering some serious praise of Spock in front of the delegation, which, of course, T'Pring heard in his place, which helps to give her a new perspective on Spock. Meanwhile, Spock, as T'Pring and Chapel go to negotiate with this Vulcan rebel, who insults Spock right to his face because he thinks he's not there, which upsets Chapel because, of course, she really digs Spock, causing her to stick up for him right to his face, which leads the other, to the other Vulcan being even more of a jerk, at which point Spock punches him, into Pring's body, punches him right out, whilst acknowledging that doing so was not very Vulcan-like, which of course it isn't. Dr. Mbenga manages to get Spock and T'Pring back in the correct bodies, whilst demonstrating that he understands a thing or two about the Vulcan Katra, which I guess is okay because nobody ever said that a human doctor wouldn't know about it, but it seems to indicate that such transfers are not unheard of, which again seems to go against what was said in Star Trek 4, because it is said, like I said earlier, that such a thing has never happened except in legend. But again, it may be that that was specifically from a human to a Vulcan, or a living person to an alive but not conscious person. So I don't know, maybe it's not a contradiction. Anyway, in the process, he also says something about how emotion probably played a role in them not being able to switch back their consciousnesses, which is interesting because it indicates that even T'Pring behaves emotionally on some level, perhaps without realizing it, which does tie into the fact that Vulcans talk a good game about not having emotions, but they do. They just bury them, really well. Later, Spock thanks Nurse Chapel for her help. She advises him to try to be honest with what he can and cannot offer to his fiancée in the future. And when he says that he will do so because Vulcans cannot lie, he adds a caveat that what he means by that is that they can't really do it the way humans do it, which is interesting, because that's new. But she tells him that she meant that he should be honest with himself. He then tells T'Pring that he experienced fear in the form of worrying that she saw him as too human to be compatible, which again demonstrates that Vulcans do have emotions. And, his expressing that to her is kind of cool, really, because it's, again, something that's going to bridge the gap, which unfortunately we know doesn't actually get bridged in the end, but at least they're making the attempt and they're learning from it. And that's what this is all about. So it's cool. He goes on to explain that in Starfleet, he's accepted for who he is, half Vulcan and half human, which is different from how he's treated on Vulcan. And T'Pring explains that she understands his commitment to duty, but that she thinks he sees his relationship with her as a duty, saying that it shouldn't be that way, that they must, both want to be there, which they both say they do, and they smooch again.
Since the invention of the kiss, there have been 5 kisses that were rated the most passionate, the most pure. This one left them all behind.
Back at the negotiations, when the delegation asks why they should join the Federation, they're told by Pike that, you probably shouldn't, for various reasons, based on their approach to life and their needs and so forth, much to the Admiral's dismay, which it would seem he did on a hunch that the delegation, the aliens, are people who have an affection or who like finding others with the capacity to see things their way. And his hunch pays off as they return to their ship and raise the Federation flag. So that was cool. He makes a note, of how they behave throughout the episode and uses that information to approach the negotiations in a way that turns out to be successful. And I think that's great for the Pike character because he really kind of needed a win as a character after a couple of episodes of his bacon kind of being saved by others, or at least kind of coming off that way. So it was great to see him as captain get a win that was all his own. So that was cool. Number 1, and La'an, meanwhile, take a walk along the top of the saucer section without EV suits on under the cover of a force field in order to sign their names on the oldest and apparently never replaced piece of the Enterprise hull at the top of the saucer, a section called the Scorch. As they're doing this, the delegation ship sails past them, which leaves them practically speechless. And it was really gorgeous. It really, really was. So that was a cool moment. We then join our happy couple post coitus, and T'Pring admits to having liked being Spock for a day. We then join Chapel and Ortegas, who discuss how things went on her date. And it turns out that Chapel blew the guy off, telling him he was boring. And Ortegas tells her that she should try being honest in the future, which again is interesting because it brings up this whole theme of honesty that's been in the episode. To which she says she would only do if she were getting serious about a guy, because that's the kind of thing that makes relationships serious, and that she would have to find the right guy for that, but stops short of saying what we all know, which is that to her, the right guy is Spock. So I thought this was a really good episode, which I thought used the characters at the right levels in terms of their participation in the story. And I thought that it gave us great character exploration vis-a-vis Spock and Chapel and T'Pring, while introducing a new race, whilst also showing Starfleet doing the thing that Starfleet is supposed to do, whilst balancing what I counted as 4 different plots, which normally doesn't work on Star Trek. 1 or 2, okay. But when they try to do more than that on Discovery, for example, and on Picard, it doesn't usually work. But here it actually worked perfectly. As I say, some people have been complaining that Captain Pike is ineffectual, but here he really brought home a win when, like I said, he single-handedly figures out the key to winning over the delegation. And, the episode was also funny and very entertaining without being heavy-handed or without being heavy. And, this is something that neither Discovery nor Picard have ever really done. Like, ever. They've never done this. They've never just had an episode that was light yet thought-provoking from start to finish in a well-balanced way and a fun way. I really feel like the people behind Strange New Worlds get Star Trek. And while there have been some things in the first 4 episodes that I didn't think struck the absolute right note for Star Trek, I have enjoyed the show since the beginning, and this episode to me has been a real high point. I really think it was perfect. I don't have like a single complaint, not a serious one anyway. Again, we're seeing a different kind of Spock, but we're supposed to be. We're seeing a Nurse Chapel that's nothing like the original Nurse Chapel, but I think the character is great. I think the actress is great. And the only thing that's bothering me is that she bears no resemblance to the name, to the character whose name she has. But, and I notice it every time, but, she's very good, and I'm going to let it go eventually. I think, they're walking the tightrope as it concerns Spock's romantic relationship deftly enough. And it's actually making me sad, like I said, that we know that things don't work out for them, because I think they're actually good for each other. The only other thing I would say that I wouldn't characterize as rising to the level of a complaint is that the aspect of the first officer's personality, number 1's personality that they showcased in this episode, is such a departure from the other aspects of her personality that we've seen up to this point. And, I'm including the cage in that. And I'm having trouble believing that, this aspect of her personality. But again, most people are able to turn off the most rigid part of themselves when they need to, after using that part of their personality when they need to use it. So I can, I have to sort of not reject this aspect of her personality out of hand, but it was just weird. I don't know. We'll see how things go. It's only the 5th episode. but I liked it. I thought it was great. And, this episode was gorgeous as hell. There were shots of the Enterprise out the window of the negotiation room on the space station, or the starbase rather, and it just looked incredible. The shots of the solar ship were unbelievable. The alien race looked fantastic. Even the new green uniform tunic, or Strange New Worlds version of it, that they came up with for this episode looked great. So I really don't have anything else to say in the review. I'm looking forward to hearing from you guys. I'm looking forward to watching other YouTubers' reviews. And from what I get from those things, I'll probably come back with a supplemental review shortly. But until then, I'm out of here, and I wish you peace and long life.